Welcome in, everybody. We're doing something a little different today. We're going
Yeah.
full deep dive on Washington lobbying.
All right.
We're talking power brokers, influence peddling, all that juicy stuff.
Good stuff.
And our guide for this little adventure is a book called The Wolves of K Street.
Oh, yeah. I've heard of this.
Have you got a chance to peek at it yet?
I have, yeah. It's a wild ride. They don't hold back.
It seems like they really wanted to, grab you by the collar and be like, listen to this.
Oh, absolutely.
Because they start with, a lobbyist found dead at, a fancy golf course.
Yeah, under mysterious circumstances.
Wow.
Very curious.
And it makes you wonder, what kind of world are we stepping into here?
Right. Talk about high stakes.
Yeah. So basically, we're going to trace the evolution of lobbying from back in the day, 3 martini lunches, all that jazz,
Filled rooms?
to, the sophisticated, sometimes kind of shady world of influence today.
It's incredible how much it's changed, you know? From a handshake and a campaign donation to, I don't know, manipulating global pandemics or something.
Yeah. So paint us a picture. What did D.C. lobbying look like before K Street became synonymous with influence?
Well, think back to the early 20th century. You've got FDR, the New Deal, all that.
Okay.
Lobbying back then, it was a lot more personal, you know?
You actually had to know the person.
Exactly. It was all about connections. Having a congressman's ear, maybe slipping a campaign donation here and there.
So not all that different than today.
Well, not in principle, I guess, but the scale, the tactics, it was all a far cry from the lobbying machine we see today.
So who are some of these early players? The ones who really shaped the game, so to speak?
Well, one name that jumps out is Tommy Corcoran. He was an advisor to FDR, became this ultimate DC fixer.
A Victor Fur.
Yeah, he wasn't officially a lobbyist, but he knew how to work the system, get things done.
Oh, I see.
He could broker deals worth millions for his clients, often with just a handshake and a well-placed phone call.
Wow. So it was that simple back then, just knowing the right people.
In a way, yeah. He understood the power of relationships, how to leverage them to get what he wanted.
Okay, so that's the old school, the OGs of lobbying. But when did corporations really start to flex their muscles in Washington?
Well, the shift really started in the 60s and 70s. Corporations facing all these new regulations, consumer protection, environmental stuff.
Yeah.
They realized they needed a bigger seat at the table.
Makes sense.
They needed a way to shape the conversation, make sure their interests were heard.
And that's where firms like Patton Boggs enter the picture.
Exactly. Tommy Boggs, the son of former Congressman Hale Boggs, he brought in some serious political connections.
Right, so we're talking legacy here.
Oh, yeah. Patton Boggs, they represented everyone, from big tobacco to foreign governments. They understood that lobbying was more than just backroom deals. It was about strategy, legal expertise, really knowing the ins and outs of government.
So it sounds like lobbying was becoming more sophisticated, more strategic.
Absolutely.
But when did it become less about quiet negotiation and more about, well, let's just say aggressive persuasion?
Well, that's where firms like Black Manafort come in. They really shook things up in the 80s, during the Reagan era.
Okay, so what made them different?
They weren't afraid to play hardball. They realized that influencing politicians wasn't enough. You had to influence the public, too. Shape the narrative.
So they were like the original spin doctors.
You could say that. They were masters of what we call wedge issues.
Yeah, it's issues.
Right.
Break that down for us.
Sure. They were experts at exploiting these divisive social issues, often with very little regard for the truth.
Oh, boy.
They ran this one campaign linking a Democratic opponent to crime and racial unrest.
Playing on people's fears.
Exactly. It was a turning point. Things were getting a lot more ruthless.
So Black Manafort, they really upped the ante, showed how powerful these kind of, fear tactics could be.
Oh, yeah. They were incredibly effective.
But were they the only ones playing this game? Were there others, maybe on the other side of the aisle, using these tactics for, different causes?
Oh, absolutely. You can't talk about modern lobbying without mentioning Tony Podesta.
Podesta. Okay, I've heard the name. Democratic strategist, right.
That's the one. Brother of John Podesta, who is Bill Clinton's chief of staff.
Right. So he was a major player, but what made him so different? How did he operate?
Well, Podesta, he brought something new to the table. He understood the power of grassroots organizing, getting people fired up and ready to move.
So less about manipulating the message from the top down, more about harnessing it from the ground up.
Precisely. He'd cut his teeth working on progressive causes, building coalitions, mobilizing activists. He knew how to rally a crowd.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give me an example. How did he actually put this into practice?
Well, take his work for Genentech back in the 90s. They were having a tough time with the FDA over this new AIDS drug.
I remember this. It was a big deal.
Right, so instead of just, dialing up his buddies in Congress, Podesta, he went straight to the HIV/AIDS activist community.
Smart. They were already fired up about the FDA dragging its feet.
Exactly. And he helped them channel that frustration into this powerful advocacy campaign, rallies, protests, the whole 9 yards, put immense pressure on the agency.
And it worked.
Let's just say Genentech got their drug approved.
Wow. Okay, so we're talking about a lot of money, a lot of influence being thrown around. Were there any rules to this game? Any consequences for, playing dirty?
Well, DC has always had its share of scandals, right? But the thing is, the industry always adapted. As regulations tightened, some figures, they moved into the shadows. That's where you get guys like Evan Morris, Jim Kortovich, the era of shadow lobbying.
Shadow lobbying. Okay, now that sounds downright sneaky.
Yeah.
How is that different from what we've been talking about?
Think less about transparency, more about plausible deniability. Evan Morris, he was a rising star at Patton Boggs, had all the right connections, especially with Democrats. But he saw an opportunity in the internet, in shaping narratives online that went beyond traditional lobbying. Remember that avian flu scare back in the mid-2000s?
Oh yeah, everyone thought it was going to be the next pandemic.
Right. Well, Morris, he was working for Roche Pharmaceuticals, the company that made Tamiflu. And they saw a chance to cash in on the fear.
Hold on. You're saying he exploited a public health scare to make money for his client?
Well, let's just say the book suggests he wasn't afraid to fan the flames a bit. He paid consultants to write these alarming articles about avian flu, slipped them to media outlets, both liberal and conservative.
Wow, just like planting seeds of panic.
The goal was to pressure the government to stockpile Tamiflu, and guess what? It worked. Bush administration ended up spending billions on the drug.
And Roche got rich. So that's Morris. What about this Kortovich guy? What was his specialty?
Kortovich, he was a master networker. He knew everyone who was anyone in media, journalism, politics, understood that influence wasn't just about pushing an agenda, it was about building trust, relationships that could pay off down the line.
So more about whispers in ears than like bulldozers through hallways.
Exactly. He would host these lavish parties at his Capitol Hill townhouse. Journalists, lobbyists, lawmakers, you name it. But even in those casual settings, he was always working. Always building those connections.
It's amazing how these tactics evolved, right? Becoming more sophisticated, more under the radar. But this was all before Trump, right? What happened when he came in and basically flipped the chessboard over?
Well, that's when things got really interesting. Trump's election, it upended the entire power structure in D.C. Suddenly, those old connections, that insider knowledge, it didn't mean as much anymore.
Yeah, it's like someone changed the rules of the game overnight.
Exactly.
Not everyone got the memo.
A lot of people scrambling to catch up.
So how did these DC insiders, these master manipulators, how'd they adapt to a president who, well, let's just say played by his own rules?
They had to get creative.
Creative how?
Well, for starters, they realized that with Trump, it wasn't about building consensus or working the halls of Congress anymore.
It was all about getting on Trump's good side.
Pretty much.
But how do you even do that with someone who seems to get all their information from cable news and Twitter?
You play a game.
So what, like buying ads during Fox and Friends?
Trump tried that.
No kidding.
The book talks about lobbyists buying ad time during Trump's favorite and least favorite TV shows, hoping to catch his eye or maybe just plant a seed.
Wow, talk about a direct line to the Oval Office.
Right. And it wasn't just TV.
What, like sending him tweets?
Some went there, but we're talking even more targeted than that. Like geo-targeting social media ads to reach him specifically, even at places like Mar-a-Lago.
So they're like following him around online with these ads. That's both hilarious and kind of terrifying.
Well, it shows how much the game has changed. Influence isn't always about backroom deals anymore. It can be a lot more in your face.
And a lot less transparent, right? It's not like these tactics are going away anytime soon.
Exactly. Which brings us to another interesting point from the book, this rise of anti-corporate sentiment.
And not just from, like, the usual suspects.
Right. It's coming from both sides of the aisle now. The book argues that the 2008 financial crisis, coupled with the Citizens United ruling, really shook things up.
Citizens United, that was the one that basically said corporations are people,
Yeah.
right? When it comes to political spending anyway.
Essentially. And it created this huge backlash.
Yeah, like people were already mad about the bailouts, and then this just felt like, I don't know, adding insult to injury.
Exactly. It fed this growing sense that the system was rigged, that corporations had too much power, and that anger, it cut across party lines.
So it's not just a left-wing or right-wing issue anymore. It's this deeper frustration with the way things are.
Precisely. And it's manifesting in some interesting ways. The book points to this growing bipartisan support for antitrust measures.
To break up big tech.
Among other things, yeah. You even have some Republicans embracing things like unionization.
Wow, really?
As a way to counter the power of corporations.
That's fascinating. It's like the old playbooks are being thrown out.
I think that's a good way to put it. The rules of the game are changing, but the big question is, what happens next?
Right. What does this mean for the future of lobbying for all these power brokers and influence peddlers?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The wolves of K Street. It doesn't offer any easy answers.
But it does paint a pretty vivid picture of how we got here.
That's for sure. And I think that's the first step in figuring out where we go from here.
Well said. Well, on that note, I think we're about out of time.
Time flies when you're talking about lobbying.
That it does. But for anyone listening, if you want a peek behind the curtain, a glimpse into how power really works in Washington, The Wolves of K Street is definitely worth checking out.
Couldn't agree more.
It's a wild ride, that's for sure.
It really is.
All right, everybody, that's it for this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious.